Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. Today's guest is J.M. Talboo, who runs the website 911debunkers.blogspot.com, which is devoted to debunking the claims of the debunkers of the 9/11 truth movement, I guess. Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole, J.M.
Hey, Mick, thanks for having me.
So I was really fascinated to look at your blog and your extensive list of websites. You had rather a lot of websites. If you click on your profile,
it's over
I think
30.
there's like 30 websites and all kinds of different topics. Like you got a bunch of political ones. You got some on the supernatural, and you got some on obviously the 9/11 one is the one we're more interested in talking about today. Can you tell me how you kind of got started, like in 9/11 truth movement, and B in like doing blogging about it and getting so involved in blogging?
Yeah, it was around 2004. I saw a film called American Empire something. I don't know. It was kind of a leftist type of film, pretty much against the Bush administration and trying to tie them into 9/11 and whatnot. But that got me asking questions. And then I saw Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 9/11. So I kind of had a slow burn. It wasn't like straight into loose change or anything like that. So I got into all that, and it was about 2008, right after the NIST report on World Trade Center 7, that I actually started blogging on the topic. I'd been an activist for like 4 years to some extent before that, but never went public with it. So that's basically how it happened for me. I just one day I just decided I wanted to talk about it publicly. It took a long time for me to actually want to do that.
So you said you were like in it for a couple of years before that. Was that just basically you doing research, or was it
right?
Were you interacting with other people during that period?
Well, like when I went to that movie, I interacted with some activists there. I put out some flyers for it, things like that. Right. But the most part, I was doing research. I remember sitting down and listening to Alex Jones, and he mentioned that he had a archive of information on 9/11, and it was all mainstream sources, and to check it out for yourself. So I sat down one Saturday and I went through the entire list and looked at all the articles, and I started to realize, because when I first heard him, I thought he was absolutely nuts. I said, this guy can't be right. There must be nothing to this. And I wasn't a fan of the Bush administration, but I didn't think they would have anything to do with 9/11, or that there could possibly be any government involvement. But the more I looked at things, I found some of it quite compelling. And a lot of it I found compelling at the time that I don't find compelling now. You had mentioned that my blog debunks the debunkers. That was the original intent, but I don't know if you noticed, there's a little sub-headline on the site now that says, refuting the hollow arguments of the so-called debunkers and truthers. So right. I don't think debunkers are always as much of a debunker as they like to think they are, and I don't think truthers are as much truthers as they like to think they are. I would hope we were all just after the truth in the end.
Yeah, no, certainly that's what I think. And I noticed reading your blog that you're not like a party line type person. You're not just doing whatever the truth movement does. Like you critique some of David Ray Griffin's stuff. And you point out flaws in his arguments. And I'm sure, like, let's say, just there's kind of a pivot point for a lot of debunkers is the Pentagon and whether a plane hit the Pentagon. And what do you feel about that whole that issue?
A plane definitely hit the Pentagon. I used to not think so for a while, but as more information came about and I looked at different researchers, some from the truth movement, like Adam Taylor was on your show. He's a friend of mine. He had mentioned Jim Hoffman. Jim Hoffman's always been very good at this subject. So yeah, I definitely stood on his shoulders with learning about a lot of this, but I wouldn't say that a lot of the truth movement picked up on his way of thinking. It's went the other way quite a bit. But yeah, I think it's quite clear that a plane hit the Pentagon. There's plane wreckage everywhere. To think that somebody went and planted plane wreckage, I mean, it goes against Occam's razor. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
If you're carrying out a conspiracy, just run the plane into the building. I mean, maybe you can remote control it. Maybe that's a possibility. I could maybe go there. But as far as it not hitting the building, and then there's even the crazier theories that it flew over. Anybody who's been at the Pentagon, I took a bus trip out there. There's no way. There's nothing but open fields and open sky.
Yeah.
You would see it. Then you got saying the phone calls were faked. That's just, I know voice morphing technology exists, but again, it's unnecessary. It's also one of these things. Even if there was truth to it, why would you lead with that? Why would you talk about it? I feel like if there is any kind of conspiracy for 9/11, pick a few good points and go with it. I don't know why people get into these, things that are offensive to people, and it's likely not true. A lot of evidence against it. There's been material written refuting David Ray Griffin and his phone call material. What else? I don't think Judy Wood's theories have any, there's no credence to those at all.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme.
There's more. It's quite a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, Judy Woods, I think she has this theory that there were energy beams destroyed the buildings, which is, I don't think really something that a large number of people in the truth movement really believe. I'm sure it's probably less than 5% or so, but it's one of those things that people pick up on. But the Pentagon thing, I think, is actually, I would say, more than half of the people that you talk to on, especially the online groups, believe that. Which I get must be kind of frustrating that so many people believe something you think is so obviously false.
Yeah, when I went to Ground Zero and I was debating people around Ground Zero and just having conversations with people, if you debate somebody out there, people are filming it. But I remember he was talking about the Pentagon stuff and yelling at me, and I'm saying, "Hey, look, back up! I don't even believe that." And he goes, "Well, you're different than 90% of the people out here." Then I said, "Yeah, you're right. I am. I'm sorry. I'm a free thinker." There's a lot of groupthink when it comes to 9/11 truth as well. So
yeah. So now obviously you're still a 9/11 truther, and you're still you still believe that there's something happened. What would you say is how would you characterize your position about what you think happens and what you think are the primary problems and questions around 9/11?
Well, like on the blog I state, and I have it here, I might as well just read what I wrote. I said, many people subconsciously make the mistake of only seeing the issues in black and white as opposed to shades of gray. This is known as the black or white fallacy. And in this case, the false dilemma is it's either Al-Qaeda carried out 9/11 or it was an inside job. I don't see it as a one or the other thing. I believe that Al-Qaeda hijackers and bin Laden were definitely involved. I just think they had assistance from people with inside the country. I would say there's evidence that points towards rogue elements of intelligence apparatus, both here and in a couple other countries, and rogue members of the U.S. government. But I wouldn't put the number of people. It's under 100, I would think, maybe much less, under 100. So I don't think it would require thousands of people being involved, as some people say, and things like that. But I think there's very interesting whistleblower claims regarding prior knowledge. You could take Patty Casaza. She's a 9/11 family member. She says that there were members of the FBI, I believe it was. And by the way, I'm going to include, at least on my blog, I can send you a list. But anything I mention, I'll try to make a list of links that not necessarily back up what I say, but just give people the sources for what I'm talking about, so they know I'm not making things up whole cloth.
Yeah.
But she had said that she was told that there were people that knew the exact day, the exact targets, and that this was completely ignored. You get a lot of information like that. There's David Shippers, who was he helped prosecute Bill Clinton back in the day, and he basically said the same thing to Nafeez Ahmed, who wrote the book The War on Freedom. He wrote another one. I can't remember what the second one was called, but basically that the exact day and the exact targets were known. So you find some corroborating information like that, which is obviously very interesting. Those whistleblowers weren't really spoken to by the 9/11 Commission, even though Patty Casaza was promised that they all would be spoken to. So that's something that I find very interesting. NORAD's response on that day I find very interesting. I've done a lot of research into NORAD, and at the end of the day, I had a debunker ask me, well, what do you think you can prove that NORAD was involved in an inside job? And I said, no, I don't think I can prove that. I think what could be proven if somebody wanted to do it is criminal negligence at the very least. And it's interesting that the 9/11 Commission did consider referring members of NORAD to the Justice Department because they had lied so bad. So, and they said it's one of those loose ends that was never really tied up.
Yeah,
so
I kind of agree with you.
That interest me beyond demolition.
I agree with you on that, the NORAD thing to a degree. Like, I think there's probably definitely some cover your ass type stuff going on. And I think, when people say the commission was set up to fail, I think part of that was just that they didn't want fingers pointed at people who failed. Whether there's something more than that, I don't really think there's personally, I don't think there's strong evidence for. And as you say, you can't really prove it. But you're going to get on to kind of controlled demolition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. I've written a little bit for their site, but they always review anything I've ever helped with. But I just think in and of itself that there are so many professionals that are speaking out. Just stepping back as like a juror, maybe looking at things. I think it's interesting. I remember I was watching your interview with Joe Rogan. He mentioned, how many architects and engineers are on the other side and they just don't come out and speak about it publicly. Well, we don't know because they really haven't outside of like the official reports and whatnot.
Yeah.
But when you look at like surveys of how many New Yorkers even knew about Building 7 and whatnot, I would argue that it's probably pretty low, the amount that even are up on these issues in any real sense.
Yeah. I think I talked to some architects and engineers that are not 9/11 truthers, and the problem I found is that they basically think it's a silly theory, and they don't want to talk about it. Like the guy I'm interviewing next after you is an engineer who worked at Ground Zero for I think at least 6 months after the attacks. He saw the initial attacks, and he worked for a big engineering firm there. And he said to me, like when I told him, like I talked to 9/11 truthers, he said, "Oh, you must have a lot more patience than I do." And basically they're scientists and engineers that I talk to who are on, I guess the skeptical side, but it's more like the apathetic side. They just don't look into it because they don't find it interesting. And I think that gets viewed by truthers as them being afraid of looking into it, or that either they know that there's something there, but they don't want to touch it. But from my perspective, it seems like they just think it's silly. In the same way you think that Judy Wood's theory is silly, they think the idea of a controlled demolition is silly, and so they won't even look into it very much.
And that could be, but then the question could be asked why they think it's silly. Is it really silly on its face, or has there been so much material, bad material, for instance, like we talked about bad theories that makes the whole thing look silly, or material that's dissuaded them from it? I don't know. I would also say, if the government would have just done some simple things like test for explosives, if NIST would have tested for explosives, this would have perhaps helped. You'll obviously have people argue that truthers wouldn't accept it either way. I don't happen to be one of them. I would definitely have liked to have seen that happen. I think you have a couple problems. One, and I could be wrong, but I've heard from people more up on these things than me, scientists, that like for conventional explosives, for instance, they would test for nitrates, and those dissipate by now, and even if you had the dust, you couldn't do it now. I'll just say, I can't say the name, but I had a friend of Larry Silverstein. You know who Silverstein is, I'm assuming. He told me that New York labs did test for explosives. I asked him to give me any evidence of this. It was never provided to me. If that actually happened, I don't know. I never saw any proof that it did. But yeah, I think that kind of testing should have happened.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of testing of the dust in the early days because they were concerned, right from the start, I think, of the effects of breathing in the dust. They were kind of like elemental analyses. I don't know if you can actually get much from just the basic elemental compositions in terms of testing for explosives. But yeah, I think again here we run up against the same problem of perspective. Like, on the truth side, they say, why didn't you test for explosives? And on the other side, they say, well, because planes flew into the buildings and they burnt for hours and then collapsed because of that. It just seems like, why would we test for explosives? And there was no real, from their mind, they see the collapse of the towers, especially, as being very obviously from the planes, because the collapse starts at the fire floors that were on fire. Now with Building 7, obviously is a bit less clear, and people who don't know about Building 7, they will sometimes they'll look at the video, and if you don't know anything at all, it looks like it's a controlled demolition. So I think it's going to be easier there. But again, the people who are on the ground of the day, from what I know, is like, a lot of them knew it was going to collapse because they could see the big hole in the side on the southwest corner, and that it was leaning a bit. and it was making lots of noises with floors falling and things, and it was all these fires, and so it wasn't a huge surprise when it fell. It was on fire after all, and it was hit by World Trade Center 7. So they think, why would we test for explosives? It's obvious why it fell. So it's a problem you can never really get past, though, I think, because if you've got people who are suspicious, they're always going to think that this is evidence of a conspiracy.
I mean, a couple points. But that's when you really have to dig in and see if things on their face make sense, like these a priori assumptions, or if there's really something more to it. Adam and I, for instance, we did an article together where we did look at the building's ability to withstand jetliner impacts. And when we did that, what we showed is that really a lot of the statements that were made from debunkers, or even Leslie Nielsen, what? That's an actor. That's a
yes, Leslie Robertson.
He said he didn't see a molten metal at ground zero. Then videos came out that he did. But it's like the debunking side of it seemed to argue that they were only designed for a slow-moving impact, not loaded with fuel like those were, and that a 707 and a 747 are comparable. And we showed a lot of that to not be correct. And that, but I do understand why, people would look at. Oh, if you want to respond, go ahead.
No, just that with they say it was designed to withstand the impact of a plane, and the thing is, it did withstand the impact of the plane. Like they could have, planes could have hit the building like that in 3 different spots, and it would have been fine. Well, it wouldn't have been fine, but it wouldn't have fallen. I mean, it fell because of the fire and because of the fireproofing being stripped off by the impact, which wasn't something that they'd really, done a detailed analysis of. They said, the biggest problem would be the fire, but I don't think they ever did. This was back in the 60s when they designed the building. They didn't really have the same, biosimulation software and finite element analysis of that detail that they would need to be able to tell if it could withstand a sustained fire. So, it was designed to withstand a jet impact, and it did. So, I always think that argument's a little bit specious. But
I mean, it's funny. One argument brings up another, though. Then you get to fireproofing, and it's like, so for fireproofing was required to be knocked off, and then there's rebuttals of that, and I mean, you think that it was only designed to take the plane impact, and then it was supposed to collapse in 15 seconds, like it did. I mean.
Well, it was designed not to fall down.
I mean, the one, he said that it would fly through it like a mosquito netting, and then it could withstand several impacts. Yeah, and I think when he said withstand, he meant withstand. Like they would put the fires out then, and it would be there to be repaired.
Yeah. But, one thing, like with I know we're kind of getting into the weeds here a little bit, but you just brought up the insulation being knocked off. And if you look at the steel in the pile afterwards, it almost invariably had no insulation left on it, from the collapse, basically. So if the collapse of the building,
the bombs knocked them off.
No, but
if there were explosives, I don't know.
The entire building, everywhere on it, you couldn't see any insulation anywhere, from this collapse, which only reached 100 miles an hour, and then you've got a plane going at 500 miles an hour. You're bound to get some insulation stripped off the beams and whatnot. There was the big explosion as well of the thing. But anyway, we're getting into details. We could probably argue.
I would just say, I know Kevin Ryan is one who's done this in detail. There are better people at me when it comes to demolition stuff. I've done a lot more research, more detailed research into NORAD and prior knowledge, to be quite honest. But Kevin Ryan's one to look to, and then Adam Taylor. Adam has tackled, he did a whole series for 9/11 Truth, debunking the real 9/11 myths, where he took on Popular Mechanics. And I'm pretty sure that in that series, he does address the fire insulation and gets into the weeds on it. Yeah. So it's one of those things. I forget, there was one other point I wanted to respond to. You'd said something about just something about the whole issue. I don't know if you can remember of why engineers and architects don't get into it, about it seeming silly. There was something else you had said. You said that the whole idea that they knew all day it was going to fall down. I don't know if you're aware of Graham McQueen. He has a paper for the Journal of 9/11 Studies called Waiting for 7. He analyzes all the testimony from firefighters saying that it was going to fall that day, and he really digs into whether most of them had direct observation, or if just a few people made that call and it kind of filtered down through the ranks.
I mean, that's quite possible.
So that's an interesting thing to look at. It's called Waiting for Seven. It's by Professor Graham McQueen. And then the question is, like, we know that there was southwest corner damage, and I think that's why the building slumps. A lot of people in the truth movement don't even want to admit that. It came straight down, and that's it.
It did lean to the south.
Slump as it came down. There was a hole in the building. But, like, Craig Bartmer was from the fire department. He said, yeah, I saw a hole in the building. I didn't see a hole big enough to bring down a building, though. So you get difference of opinion within the ranks on that, too. And obviously there have been firefighters come forward from that day. I wouldn't say it's a tremendous amount like with the architects and engineers, but there are quite, last I knew, maybe 100. There might be more now, though. There has been an FDNY come forward that thinks things are strange as well. So it's not just crazy ones like me that think these things. There are people that were there that day. So.
Yeah, no, there's I think within any profession, like obviously the firefighters and the steel workers, you're always going to find people who have like differing opinions and different experiences. You know, a lot of people there on the day, they heard things that they interpreted as being explosions. Some of them before the towers collapsed, and some of them while the towers were collapsing. And some people even claim that they heard explosions before the planes hit the building, which is an interesting one, which I don't think is kind of a difficult one to substantiate. But
there's the one explosion where the fire department person says, we got to get back. Some people think he says 7's exploding. Some people think he says the building's exploding, but they're definitely by World Trade Center 7. When you listen to that explosion and compare it to a shaped charge, they sound very similar. The thing is, that's taking place much earlier in the day. If Building 7 was blown up, people have proposed the idea that it was either a dud and didn't go off all at one time, or that this was on purpose, like pre-weakening throughout the day. Barry Jennings talks about hearing explosions throughout the day. He talks about stepping over bodies in World Trade Center 7, which there aren't supposed to be any bodies in World Trade Center 7.
So how do you got your conflicting testimonies from one guy, but you can say this bit is correct. It's like, what's his name? Danny Juenko, the Dutch demolition expert. He said that Building 7 looked like a controlled demolition.
Right.
But he also said that buildings 1 and 2 did not look like controlled demolitions.
Right.
But
which they don't. They don't look like they don't explode it. They don't do that in demolitions because it would.
He didn't
go
just say
everywhere.
they didn't look like it. He said there was no way that they would do a demolition like that because it was just ridiculous. I was going to say something else.
But then you have Craig Bartmer on your side. You have not Danny Javinko, but the Mark Lazo, the head of Controlled Demolition Incorporated. They don't think it was controlled demolitions. They are demolition experts. But there's also demolition experts within the ranks of 8911 Truth, too. Maybe not to the extent of those individuals, but they did demolitions for the military, for instance, things like that. So, yeah, you get it on both sides. But that's the thing. There is a debate. It's a legitimate debate enough. I mean, I would think just the Halsey study makes this a legitimate debate as far as World Trade Center 7. I know you're not particularly impressed with what you see there so far. It's funny because I look at the same models that you look at and I see something different. I know reality's not the same for everybody the way they view it. Like,
well,
thoughts on that?
The Halsey study. This is like a study that architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth paid. I don't know how it works, but they paid the University of Alaska $316,000 to do a study. Like they financed a study, and Professor Halsey was the guy leading it, and he had 2 graduate students working on it, one of whom left halfway through, and they built some models of the World Trade Center. They investigated a variety of things like whether this certain connection would have failed, the connection between A2001, the girder, and column 79. And then they did these full-scale models, which is the main thing that I critiqued, that they had these models of World Trade Center 7. I have a small paper model of World Trade Center 7 here. But the thing that looks so strange to me about their models is that they claim that they did what's called dynamic analysis of the model, which is where you simulate the movement response of the building. And if a girder bends and then fails, it will fall and it will hit other girders. It accounts for the actual movement of the building as a whole, its momentum. And they have this one animation that they say is a dynamic response, and it just basically consists of the building just tilting over perfectly straightly to the side, kind of like at an angle, actually more like this, over the bottom half and the bottom third. And the bottom third isn't connected to the top, and there's no collision between the two. And it just looks like all they did was take a 3D model and then just add a rotation, translation, transform to move the top half of it. It doesn't actually look like a dynamic analysis.
I'm not an expert on these things. I know there's the 3 animations they have. I wondered about those other 2 myself. I think the one is where they have all the columns that, they kind of show them kind of go like this, and then it has a global collapse instead of a progressive collapse. I didn't know if the other 2 were like steps to them learning something else, and I really got to dig into this more. But I get what you're saying. It looks odd, but a lot of NIST computer modeling stuff looks odd. I will say, I think he's working with better software than they were working with back then. 8 years prior or 10 years prior? It was in 2008.
Well, you think his renderings would look better then if you look at them. You compare to NIST, they've got this incredibly detailed model, and there's things falling off all over the place, columns collapsing, there's deformation of all kinds of things. Whereas if you look at his model, even the money shot version that you see on the cover, you see this weird kind of egg-breaking, butterflying, hinged penthouse that just kind of sways open and then lowers itself down into the building, and then the other penthouse lowers itself down into the building, and then the building kind of falls down. He doesn't even show the columns being removed, like what columns did he actually remove, or any deformation whatsoever. It's all very strange, and I've made a little video explaining what my objections are, and I sent it to Professor Halsey just this morning. Because I'd like to get a response, but I've emailed him before a few times and never got any response. But I think
I could try to help you get one. I could see if maybe I could get somebody to listen to me. I don't know.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'd like them to, if they can improve what they've done through suggestions right now. That's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So, but I do like that NIST, they admitted the stiffeners, the shear studs, the steel plates. He put all that into his analysis, and I think that has to be something that's better. Would you not agree with that?
Well, it's certainly better to have things in than not, but you still got to come back to the end result. It doesn't look like it's an actual analysis. It looks like it's an animation. So I'm a little confused as to what's going on there. This is kind of technical, but he does like a static analysis, and a dynamic analysis. And a static analysis is meant to be like working out what the forces and deformations are of a building. It's not really meant to simulate a building while it is collapsing. You use it to see if a building will collapse. But he simulates it all the way until the building is like at 45 degrees. And he has the columns at the back of the building all stretched out to 3 times their natural length, which it'd be an impossible thing to do in the simulation. Those columns would have failed. But in his thing, they're still providing support. So it seems, I don't know, it just seems like it's inexplicable how he actually got the results that he did. He claims that he did, but I think my feeling with that, this is kind of speculative, is that his graduate students built these models. He didn't build the models, and they did some tests. Yeah, I'm sure he had some input on it, but I don't think he did the work himself. And I think he told them to do tests. They did them. They gave some animations back to him, and then he just said, "Oh well, this looks like this, and let's try something else." And they went back and forth and did a bunch of things, and this is what they ended up with. And I don't really understand how a dynamic simulation could have ended up with this result. But anyway, this is probably boring to most people because it's a bit too technical. But this is something that's playing out in the 9/11 Truth movement right now. Is that architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are really pushing this thing. This study by Professor Halsey on the University of Alaska, and it's kind of like their last gasp in a way. It's like the great white hope of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, in that they think this is the thing that's going to prove once and for all that it was controlled demolition. I don't think it can
prove anything. At the end of the day, even if you like one of these studies more than the other, I mean, they're computer modeling, they're not forensics, it's not chemical analysis. It's not suspects. It could lead to something else, but will it? I would say probably not. I have some hope, but not a whole lot. We're a long way away from this thing at this point.
That's the problem.
Sometimes I do what I think is the right thing to do, whether I think it'll succeed sometimes or not. I think NIST admitted a lot that he tried to include. I don't know all the technical. I'm still digging into this whole thing. It's still comments right now. NIST, again, we can't check theirs. Not that I would be able to anyway, but they didn't release their modeling to be able, like what they did. They withheld it from the public. As far as I know, his is going to be open to the public to test these things for people that have the ability to do it themselves. So I think that's a good thing as well.
Yeah. Well, hopefully someone will look into it. The problem is, of course, the software they use, SAP 2000. I think it costs about $3,000, so it's a bit beyond my budget. I could maybe crowdsource it, and then.
But they use two programs that I've heard.
Yeah,
so they double cross-reference them. They're probably both that price, I would imagine.
Right. They use Abaqus and SAP 2000, the two software programs. Abaqus they used for the more detailed analysis, where they were studying the behavior of joints and what the response would be for an individual connection for like a girder to a column connection. And then they use that to formulate spring models for the connections. But what they use for the global collapse models, the dynamic ones, which are the kind of the blue and red models that you see, that was the SAP 2000, which is a fairly standard software for that type of thing. NIST used a thing called, they used Abaqus as well. Oh no, that wasn't Abaqus. I can't remember what it was now. Was it Abaqus? I think they used Abaqus for the first one still. Yes, they did. They used Abaqus for the similar detail thing, but then they used a thing called LS-DYNA for the global collapse models, and they used an actual dynamic analysis. I think a nonlinear dynamic analysis, which again is another more technical distinction. But you've worked with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
I've written for them. I've done some conference calls and whatnot. And I was on the writing team for a little while. So yeah.
So you said you wrote some of the facts, the frequently asked questions on architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. How did that come about? Is this like your specific area of expertise?
I mean, it's stuff like the ones that I covered, like the one was about squibs. That's something at the Debunkers blog we've talked about a lot about. I mean, so it wasn't really hard. The way I approached it was, well, I think a lot of people would ask a lot of the kind of questions that debunkers bring up. There was people that pushed back on that. I was like, I don't think so much. I think a lot of the things that debunkers bring up are common sense questions that just the general public has sometimes. So that's how I got those to go through in that way. The one was about sounds of explosions and whether they're consistent. I talked about a little bit of what I include there just earlier. And then the squib issue, whether there's, the building popping out because it's falling down or because there's pre-planned explosives ahead of the demolition of the collapse. And then the other one wasn't technical at all. It was just why does AE 9/11 Truth represent so few architects and engineers of the total? So kind of touched on those things a little bit with the squib issue. I mean, the biggest thing is some of them are like 40 to 60 stories down. So you can say that's escaping air if you want. I don't know. It seems odd to me, but
yeah, I can see how it would seem odd. But another thing that I don't want to get into too much detail there, but what you're talking about is the puffs of smoke and dust and debris in some instances that shoot out of the sides of the building, World Trade Center, like lower than the actual kind of collapse wave. So it looks like it could be some kind of explosion. But it also looks like a jet of stuff shooting out, rather than an explosion. But I guess some explosions do kind of look like that, but they're rather large. But the conventional theory is that this is overpressure, which is basically very high pressure has blown the windows out. And the objection, like you just said there, is that it's too far ahead of the collapse wave.
Too far ahead, too powerful, too fast, and that it's actually crushed building components, that it looks like it's blown up materials and not just puffs of dust or puffs of air, as people put it. That's the argument in a nutshell. I mean, it gets a little more intensive, but that's about it. I mean, and you do see these in controlled demolitions. That's the other thing. So it would be consistent. But then you have like David Chandler. He thinks he sees them every single spot as the building's coming down. I couldn't imagine there'd be that many explosives in the towers if it was. I mean, if there were explosions in the towers, I would imagine that they're not as many as some truthers would think. I think gravity has to be doing a lot of the work, and there probably was some crushing down to some extent. I mean, those are tall buildings coming down, and I'm sure the gravity did some of that work. So I don't think there had to be like tons of explosives on every single floor. For instance, you could do some pre-weakening and explosions every so many floors just to bring it down.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the history of 9/11 Truth and digging into the history of architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth, and some of the blogs that existed kind of as precursors. I think they still exist. I can't remember which ones they are now. One of them had this theory about the ceiling tiles all being explosives. And it was literally all of the ceiling tiles in the entire building had been replaced with explosive ceiling tiles. And obviously it's a ridiculous thing, but at the time people believed. Some people obviously believed.
Well, that's actually Jim Hoffman. Maybe that's
oh, is it?
I think that he got criticized a lot for that, but he was tasked with come up with something hypothetical that maybe been done. I don't think he had to go to that place though. I mean, like I said, you have some strategically placed explosives. Gravity does some of the work. Some incendiaries may be placed throughout the building. I don't know what the minimum would be required, but I mean, I just think that perhaps it's not as much as some people would like to,
Yeah.
It would seem to bode better for our case that the less is more with that kind of thing,
Because it would be easier.
Yeah.
Easier to do. Yeah.
But I don't know what the minimum requirement would be. But it just seems to me that maybe people overestimate a little bit. And how about this? This is interesting. Crockett Gravy is a 9/11 Truth guy. He didn't discount the possibility that he was asked, could foreign terrorists have planned with this? And he said, it's possible, maybe. You had Muhammad Atta looking around the buildings, or was it Muhammad Atta? It was one of them. I can't remember offhand. William Rodriguez, the janitor, said he saw one of what he recognized later to be one of the hijackers. Probably wasn't Atta, actually, but you can look this up. And he said the person had asked him, how many bathrooms are on this floor? Things like that. So there's an interesting thing. I mean, could it
seems highly implausible to me that they would plant explosives like months ahead of time and then fly the planes in a specific day and then trigger the explosions correctly. I don't know. It seems even more outlandish than the idea of the U.S. government doing it. To me, just why wouldn't they? Yeah, they before they just had one truck bomb that they used in the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, and that didn't work. So they would, I could certainly imagine them trying to blow up the World Trade Center again, but it just seems so.
Did the FBI give that bomb to that guy? Have you looked into that claim?
Yeah, I mean the guy says some guy says something about it, but it's.
Well, did he not get someone on tape?
Yeah, I think that the guy, the 93 bomber, I'm not sure who it was exactly. Says he had some contact with the FBI,
right?
And that he had an FBI handler. I can't remember the details of it, but I guess people can look it up. There's certainly a theory around that.
Well, the New York Times reported on it at the time. I don't know, but let me ask you this, Go, because I saw you on Rogan. One of the criticisms I saw people in the comments making was, yes, conspiracy theories, there's too many, they're overblown, this kind of thing. But do you believe you believe criminal conspiracies happen, correct?
Oh, yeah,
do you believe any major conspiracy theories? Is there any that you give credence to?
Well, the conspiracy theories I believe are to a large extent the ones that most people would just accept as fairly obvious, that there is a lot of essentially corruption and graft in the government and in industry, and in amongst the rich people in the country, that people are doing things for their own self-interest and not really the interests of the people at large. So you get corruption in terms of people trying to influence politicians. Like you'll get the prison lobby trying to influence politicians to increase mandatory minimum sentences. and they do this in a variety of ways, and some of them kind of verge on bribery. And we know also that politicians accept bribes because it's happened in the past and people are being prosecuted for it. So we know if like a bunch of politicians are being caught for accepting bribes, there must be a bunch of politicians who are essentially, getting bribed, getting money for their position, either for information or for influencing legislation. So I think that type of thing happens. I think there's within industry there's deception of what's going on in industry, like big pharma probably pumps up the value. Big pharma wants the FDA to approve its drugs. It's possible that there's some fudging of results going on here and there. I don't know I don't really have any good evidence of that, but it's quite possible. There's this really, really strong profit motive. And there's maybe executives who've got all their money in stock options, and they know that if this drug doesn't get pushed through, then they're going to lose like $20 million personally. So they personally have a very strong incentive to do some little fudging, do some little pushing, do something to get this drug passed. I don't know if that actually happens, but there's certainly a very strong incentive for that to happen. And we know there's loads of...
They want to then cover up a cure or not do research into herbal medicines because it would cut their profit motive down? Would you go that far?
No, I wouldn't really go that far because, if herbal medicines could be a cure for something, they would sell them. Drug companies sell lots of very cheap stuff, and drugs go generic after a while.
Well, wouldn't they try to take an extract from it, synthesize it, and make it their own? Though they wouldn't sell it because there's no money to be made on a cheap herb.
Yeah, well, herbs are problematic as a medicine because the dosage amount that you get in an herb is very variable. If you look at nutritional supplements, which are sold kind of like not evaluated by the FDA, but they really are saying this will cure your cancer. The actual amount of the active ingredient is very variable in those. So and the broader topic there, this is something I talked about in a recent podcast, was that if there was a cure for cancer, would people really be that evil that they would cover up a cure for cancer just to make a bit more money when they're already making tens of millions of dollars a year personally?
I think cancer's pretty it's a complicated thing though, because there's so many different types of cancers and they each can be treated so much differently.
So there's some, like, say, breast cancer. If there's a cure for breast cancer, which kills like hundreds of thousands of women every year, including the wives and mothers of and the actual CEOs and people who work in industry. It's this thing that affects everybody. Everybody knows someone who's been affected by one of the more common forms of cancer, if not the rarer ones. It just seems that there isn't really a good motive.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy that's evil in that case, though, either. It could just be like, if you look at the history of medical history, there's a lot of things we've learned over time where we were doing things completely wrong. There could be better ways that we could be doing things right now. Yeah, I wouldn't discount other countries' medical fields. They do take different approaches than we do. So, like, because there's a documentary. It's called Cancer Curable Now. But if you look at it, it doesn't say, "Oh, here's a pill that cures cancer." It's just, here's some different ways different physicians are approaching it across the world. So I don't know.
And some cancers can be cured. There's some that are quite treatable, and some that respond very well to various therapies like chemotherapy. So it's cancer itself, like you say, is a very complicated thing. It's essentially lots of different diseases, and each individual one is going to have like a different treatment. Is this something you blog about? This type of thing?
Yeah, I blog about alternative health things. My ex-wife was a nurse and took a lot of interest in that. So I bounced things back and forth with her. And,
interesting.
Yeah. No, I don't have any problem with people that I mean, for instance, Western medicine, you can't. It's the only way you're going to get diagnosed with anything, whatever you want to do. It's second to none when it comes to finding out what's wrong. And even now, when it comes to alternative treatments, Western medicine is more and more accepting of trying anything you want to try, as long as it doesn't conflict with what they'd like to do. But everybody makes their own decisions. Yeah, it's something I talk about. I'm not so sure we see exactly eye to eye, but I get where you're coming from. I try to find middle ground with as many things as I can. Something you mentioned is that you do understand that power breeds corruption, and that is an MO of the world. That's kind of why I say that there's an intellectual case for conspiracism. If somebody wants to think that conspiracies are the norm and not an aberration, I think there's a case that can be made for that, because I just think that's how power operates. You can find studies where they'll show you that people that get into positions of power, that seek those positions, they tend to be like sociopathic, narcissistic kind of people. And so, will they get together with other people that are like that and make plans in secret to do bad things? Yeah, a lot of times they get caught. Yeah. And then there's things you can look at. Like there's an article called 33 Conspiracy Theories That Turned Out to Be True. There's another one called 42 Admitted False Flags. And one of those is very interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard of Operation Gladio. But Gladio was a false flag terror program set up by the CIA and NATO. And it was eventually exposed. But it wasn't just a single event. It was an ongoing operation where for decades it was secret. And there was hundreds of innocent people killed in bombings and whatnot, and they blamed it on other groups. So they were literal false flags, and it's not disputed as far as I know. I don't know anybody that's trying to dispute it at this point. So it's things like that. Like I just interviewed Larry Pinckney. He was one of the original Black Panthers back in the 60s. He doesn't like them now, but he said, so when somebody wants to question Sandy Hook or whatever it may be, they should try to be responsible with what they do, but they don't just have the right to do that. They have an obligation to look at anything and say, is something wrong here? And I thought that'd be something you might want to talk about with, and I agree, every time there's a shooting, right, false flag, people come out of the woodwork and say false flag, even when there's no evidence of it. Sometimes, though, like with Parkland, I think it was, there were reports, some people saying there were 3 shooters and things like that. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were trying to figure out, why is that? If it's not a false flag, why do we get reports like that? I said, could it be people saw the police come in, and they're in black and whatnot, and they're actually going after the shooter? And so some people misconstrue that and think there's multiple shooters. Could be.
I've thought about that particular question quite a bit, actually, because it's something that always happens. You always get these reports of multiple shooters. You remember Sandy Hook? They were looking for other shooters. Like there was like a man in the woods, and turned out to be just one of the
they had a guy
arrested
too, but then there's no follow up. That's the problem with a lot of that.
Yeah, well, they identified the guy and let him go because he was like, I think one was a cop was coming through the woods. But anyway, like I think these things always happen. Like every single mass shooting, regardless of what you think about it, they starts out with possible multiple shooters. And it never pans out. It's always just one shooter. And I think the reason for that is kind of an abundance of caution on the police's part. The police will always assume that a crime scene is going to be active, even though they've shot and killed, or arrested somebody. They don't know, for a start, is this the actual guy who did all this shooting earlier? And they don't know, like, if there is somebody else. So they're going to be saying, what they're looking to see if there's another shooter. And I think it's very, very easily for that situation that the police are looking for another shooter to get interpreted as being there is another shooter. And then people, it's a chaotic situation. People are running every direction. They're hearing gunshots. Gunshots are echoing from different places. And it can sound like there's multiple people shooting. And they could run one way and they could hear it from somewhere else. And they say, like, oh, I heard it over here. And then I heard it over here. There's multiple shooters. But they never pan out. And the fact that they never pan out, I think, just indicates how easy it is for people to falsely make that assumption that there's multiple shooters. Even in the Las Vegas shooting, where the guy was shooting from the top of, one of the hotels, I can't remember what it's called now. Anyway, the
Mandalay Bay.
Yeah, Mandalay Bay, yeah. He was shooting from, he had 2 hotel rooms that he was shooting from. And if you listen to the audio of that, like you hear this bang, 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 and then you hear this boo, 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 boo. And it sounds like there's 2 different sets of gunshots coming from different places. And that's very compelling to people. But when you look at the actual timeline, what was happening, he was like, first of all, he was shooting at the crowd. And then later he was like, he was shooting at the security guard, I think, who was outside his door. So you've got this 2 very, very different audio things, because one is out of a window and one is kind of like, almost down the hallway a little bit. But because things like that happen, you get these different different types of audio, it's very, very easy for people to think there's multiple shooters. And you get things like you can see flashes coming from other places, and people say, "Oh, it's coming from over there." Yeah, they're running for their lives. They've got no idea like what's actually going on. They don't have time to sit there and carefully analyze where the shots are coming from. They just think they sort of see something and they think that's the shooter. So I think it's very, very easy for it to appear to be multiple shooters. You can go back to JFK, the kind of mother of all conspiracy theories in America, and people think that I think they canvassed the eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza, and I think it was like a certain percentage think that there was 3 shots, a certain percentage think there was more than 3 shots, some of them think there was less than 3 shots, and some of them think it came from over here, some of them think it came from over there. So, even way back then, you got the exact same thing going on. You have a single shooter, presumably, but you got lots of people thinking there are multiple shooters. So it's gonna happen like that.
I agree with you generally what you're saying. I think it's overblown. That doesn't mean that I don't think that some of them are still very interesting. I do. I've never heard the explanation you just brought up for Vegas. I know Mike Adams from Natural News. He said he did a audio analysis, and he still thinks it was, I don't know. Did you look at what he had to say?
I did. It was. I can't remember exactly, but it was pretty nonsensical.
At this point, it's been a while.
Yeah, he did some kind
JFK, it's interesting. There was one of the guys that was involved. He was involved in the second House Select Committee thing where they said there was audio. They looked at the audio and said there's other shooters.
Yeah.
But he actually said he saw autopsy doctoring, that he saw this firsthand, that they had covered up a bigger hole in his head and whatnot. And he wrote a whole book on it. Again, it's here. I think it's right here. The book's called "Inside the Assassination Records Review Board: Inside the Government's Final Attempt to Reconcile the Conflicting Medical Evidence." Douglas P. Horn. Right. Yeah, he says he'd actually seen evidence of doctored autopsy stuff, and he was one of the investigators. That's an interesting case because no matter what you think of the second one, there was a second investigation.
Yes, and they said that there was a conspiracy. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of obviously JFK was in a way like the start of the interest in conspiracy theories, and the term conspiracy theories started to come into popularity around then. Some people think that the CIA invented it, but it actually kind of started.
Well, they seem to have from that document. Yeah.
Well, I write about that in my book, and I investigated that a lot. And if you read the document, they never actually tell you to use the word conspiracy theory. They just simply use it themselves, and they say what you should do with conspiracy theorists is you should attack their arguments and try to discredit them by showing that they are wrong. They don't actually say call them conspiracy theorists. They just use the term in the same way that other people actually used the term at the time. It started. If you look at a graph of the usage of the term in newspapers,
I'll have to go back and look at it again. Yeah, I thought it had suggested it for use of their assets in the media.
No, that's a conspiracy theory.
They had assets in the media, though. That came out in the recent JFK files.
Yeah, they did.
40 journalists that were working fairly directly for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like the propaganda arm of the government, essentially. Like, to what extent does that exist? I used to be a game programmer, and I know people that do video games that are army-based video games. They kind of work with the army in some cases to make the games more realistic, but they're also liaising with the army. And it's like, is this a little bit of propaganda coming through in video games? To what extent is that type of thing going on? I'm kind of suspicious of anything that's involving the military in terms of, their motivations for what they are doing. But that's kind of getting into broader topics. I just want to really quickly, something you mentioned earlier was sound analysis, and that reminded me of, Tony Zambotti is a guy, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and we were having a big discussion with him on Metabunk where he had done some sound analysis of the Plasco building collapse in Iran. This was this building, it was about half the height of the Building 7, I think, if that. It was only like 15 floors, but it collapsed from fire. And Tony thought that he did this sound analysis that proved that there were explosions going on. But we looked into that in a lot of detail, and it turned out his analysis was completely bogus. But what's your opinion of the whole Plasco thing? Is this building in Iran? It was an old building. It had a bunch of people living in it, or having shops in it, and there was a fire, and at some point it collapsed, and something's about it looks very similar to both World Trade Center 7 and the tower collapses. So what do you think about that?
I know what the Truth Movement's view is on it. I've put that out there for people to look at. And I mean generally speaking what the view is, but I think there's evidence that building wasn't built very well, which is and it might have lacked shear studs as they thought World Trade Center 7 did or said it did, even though I don't think there's evidence of that. Mm-hmm. So it could very well just be a natural collapse, but I would think it's because of poor design, and that's probably something that might be quite prevalent in Iran, I might guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's pre-revolution Iran, which I think had perhaps better building codes, but better building codes, but it'd fallen into disrepair. I think it probably wasn't.
Yeah, I think there were some reports about that, and then other people. I'm pretty sure I saw somebody say that there was reason to think that it probably didn't have good shear studs, and there was reports from officials there that it wasn't in that great a shape. So,
yeah.
And it didn't fall that fast. I don't think, in particular for how small of a building it was. Yeah. There was molten metal apparently, and there are things that look like squibs.
This creates a lot of problems in a way if it was actually a natural collapse, because if this evidence, like molten looking, what looks like molten metal.
Yeah, we don't know much about what's there though. I mean, we know a whole lot more about what was found at World Trade Center. At the World Trade Center and the conditions and everything. So, I don't know. I mean, the fires at Ground Zero burned for 100 days. I don't, a lot of people think that's odd that they burned that long, but even burning it, you would understand why that could create more molten metal. But yeah, why would it happen that quickly there? But what kind of metal is it? And
was it actually molten metal though? I mean, we've got this crappy low resolution video of like a excavator digging something up that's glowing.
Do you mean it in Iran or
in Iran?
Yeah. So do you think there wasn't then, perhaps, or
no? I don't think it was molten steel.
Okay.
In either case, I don't, because fire.
In either case.
Yeah, in either case, I don't think the fire burns hot enough to burn steel, to melt steel into a liquid form, and if it did, like, it's not going to be there like days
That's assuming
afterwards.
It's just fire. I mean,
exactly.
Did not have molten concrete in some?
That's I don't really buy this molten concrete idea either, because concrete.
That's how they advertise it.
Yeah, they do, but
molten concrete that's encased a gun, for instance.
People use the term melted and molten to refer to a whole bunch of things. And it's...
Well, I won't dig in the weeds with you about this.
No.
I can provide what I think.
We could go on for hours discussing this type of thing.
Countering the criticism of the Warren Report, they do say employ propaganda assets to answer and refute the attacks of critics. So they don't just say take on these conspiracy theorists and say they're wrong. They say employ their propaganda
They say our propaganda assets should do this, but they don't say call them conspiracy theorists.
No, you could. I'll concede that. I don't see that in my notes here when I talked about it before. I guess that's just something I've kind of latched onto assuming over the years, or perhaps people say that so much.
There's a book that's written about it. I can't remember what it's called. Maybe Conspiracy Theory. But the guy basically makes the claim that they do tell you to use the word conspiracy theory, but because they knew this memo would come out eventually, they kind of did it in code. So
here's a question: was that term used before then, or
I researched
conspiracy theorists. Did people refer to things like that before, or was there even an idea about this before the JFK thing?
Yeah, it was. The term conspiracy theory was actually synonymous with another term called the devil theory. And if you look up devil theory and Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, you will see people referring to Barry Goldwater's response to not getting elected as a devil theory and as a conspiracy theory. So it was kind of like a changeover. Devil theory wasn't super popular back then, but conspiracy theory was used to refer to people usually on the radical right in America. There's a little bit of research on it. I discuss this in my book. I'm not trying to get you to buy my book or anything, but I do have a whole chapter. The first chapter is called The Conspiracy Theory, where I look at the history of the term. And it wasn't very common. And I think it really was the death of JFK and all the theories around that popularized the term, because it wasn't just that the media wasn't trying to discredit people. The media was describing what was happening, and what was happening at that time was there were lots of theories about a conspiracy. So you got to kind of refer to these theories in some way. What the media's going to do? There's lots of theories of conspiracy around the JFK death. There's lots of conspiracy theories around the JFK death, and then naturally it's conspiracy theorists. But yeah, it did really start there. It peaked a bit, I think, after the second report came out. There was another fairly big peak around. There was a small peak around Robert Kennedy's death. Then there was a big peak around Watergate, because the term was used there because there was lots of speculation about what actually happened, and I think people were.
What was it called? A conspiracy or a conspiracy theory?
Conspiracy theory, yeah. Watergate.
Okay. So, but it does have a derogatory connotation.
It does, yeah. It definitely does. It definitely does.
Maybe it's wearing off a little bit, though. I mean, I got to think the mainstream media has barely even talked about the Halsey report. I think it's worthy to be talked about. And I say, hey, look, at least Mick West is talking about it. That's more than they're doing. Most of them. There was a CBS affiliate that just picked it up, and I think some of this has taken a little while. Even InfoWars took 2 days to pick it up.
Yeah,
part of that might be confusion that they kind of released this before, like in 2017, but not all of it.
I got confused. I was looking on YouTube, and I thought I was looking at the current presentation. I was actually looking at the one from 2017, but they look so similar. But yeah, no, I think it will get more publicity simply because it's being pushed by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth as being this holy grail type thing, and everyone's who's a good who's really into 9/11 Truth is going to be saying, oh look, a university professor has proved that fire could not have caused the collapse, and they'll just point to it. Without really looking at the details, I think. But I think I have identified a few problems with it, which will probably play out over the next weeks and months, and maybe they'll come out with a revised report. But we'll see.
Well, I'll keep an eye on you. A lot of people are giving you a lot of problems in your comments. I don't know if you look. You got your debunkers trying hard at you there at YouTube. No, like Adam told you, I'm not 100% that the towers were controlled demolitions, especially not more so, I believe, with Building 7. Even with that, who knows what the truth could be? It could be people that had prior knowledge and an insurance scam. I don't know. I don't know the truth 100%. I just want to find it. I do look at 9/11 as a cumulative case of, is there something more? Is there something wrong? And that's why I do focus attention on NORAD and the foreknowledge and whistleblowers, and the family members having 70% of their questions not adequately answered, at least to what they thought would be adequate by the commission. I've always found to not be, that's not satisfactory to me. And then you can look at Bill Doyle. He went on the Alex Jones show in 2006. He has a 9/11 victims family network of 7,000 people. He said he talked to most, if not all of them, and he would estimate that half of them at least believed there was some kind of inside job element to 9/11. So if that's true, you're talking as many people that died that day as, there are that many family members or more that have views that are at least somewhat in line with mine. So,
this is a lot of people believe that something suspicious happened on 9/11 to one degree or another. So, and the questions are going to persist for a very, very long time.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting a long ways away from this. Like you said, it did breathe some life into it with this new report, but you're still going to continue on with the everything's a false flag. And I got your points perfectly that you made about the shootings. And I wish people would take that to heart. They have to be careful. Everybody should be as careful as they can be. But there's things, even like, there are times when there are reports of multiple shooters where the people say they actually saw these shooters. Yeah. But that's when I wonder, did they see police and get confused or something?
Or just some guy running.
Well, like the one girl, she said she was with the shooter. I think I don't know. I think it was Nicholas Cruz, one of these guys. I don't even care what their names are. We shouldn't even say them. Yeah. She said she was with him when she heard shots from somewhere else. I don't know though. Why would she say that? Would she lie to protect him, or
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that
She
case.
said she was walking down the hallway with him when shots came from the other end of the school. So, I mean, it's hard to mistake what she's saying, but
But if you've
at
got
the end of the day, it's
conflicting,
anecdotal, it's testimony,
yeah,
and
if you've got
people
conflicting
say things.
reports, someone's wrong.
Yeah,
So yeah, who knows what's going through her mind? What she actually saw, and why she either she's obviously either lying, she's mistaken, or she's telling the truth. So you got those three possibilities, and you got to like rank them. What's the most likely thing that happened? I'd start like being, I guess, charitable and say that she was mistaken and she was confused after the fact because she was so traumatic and she was mistaking things, and then maybe she was, like you say, making it up to cover for him. And then a much less likely possibility, but I never like to take things off the list, is that she's telling the truth and there was this big, there was something else going on in addition, or maybe there was just some, I don't know, a car backfiring or something. So I guess you're going to keep doing this type of 9/11 truth. Are you still active? Are you feeling a bit of debunker fatigue or truther fatigue like
no, I've
Adam?
slowed down a lot. And look, you asked Adam this, like, would you recommend this to other people? I wanted to answer that myself too, because the answer is not necessarily. You could call going after government corruption and things courageous. You could also understand that being, having a basically being fearless and being courageous, they're very similar to being stupid. If you're going to do these things, take it easy, do it in bits and pieces. Don't obsess on it. Don't make it your life. Look, if you think there's government corruption and you want to fight it, you could take that's a way to go about it. But you could also go, but what's the point? Why would I do that? Because I want to make the world a better place, for instance. That's why I do what I do. Well, you could focus on the negative and try to fight it. Or you could go, well, there's this politician that I like, and he's trying to bring people jobs, and I think that's a good thing. So I'm going to focus on him, and I'm going to focus on promoting that. Instead of fighting the bad, I'll promote the good. And it's healthier for you to do that, really. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying be smart about how you do it. It can have a psychological effect. Even architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, they have a whole psychology, wing that has warned people against this very thing, or at least acknowledged that that's why a lot of people stay away from it. And that makes sense. I'm sure they do for that reason, So that's my advice. If you're going to do it, do it sparingly. Take R&R. Don't obsess on it. Don't make it your life. So Will I continue? When there's things to report, sometimes I blog out of just habit. I'm just so used to doing it, talking about this. But yeah, like you said, I have like 30 websites where I have varied topics, and that's how people should try to be. Don't spread yourself too thin. Life's too short to focus on one thing or one area all the time. And try to enjoy your life.
Yeah, that's very good advice, I think. Sure, like if you think the things are important, then look into them. But, where you can actually make a change and where your life can be improved personally is like things that I think people should focus on. But because I'm a debunker, people are going to be saying I'm trying to persuade people not to look in 9/11 Truth. But, if that's your thing, then go for it. Look into it. But, have a life too.
No, I don't see you as trying to dissuade anybody. If anything, I've always thought debunkers helped refine the case for what we were making. Like I said, you're bringing it up when a lot of mainstream news isn't, but you're trying to get people to think critically, and so even if somebody doesn't agree with you, if it makes them not buy into all the bullshit that's out there, then that's better. Sorry, cuss on your show there, but yeah. So no, I think what you're doing is positive. I do.
Thanks.
And
yeah, and I appreciate your approach as well. Like, you're not just pushing one point of view. You're trying to actually find the truth. We have disagreements on various points, but we also have agreements on various points. So that's good.
Yeah, I'm not a flat earther.
And you're not a Pentagon missile guy or a Judy Woods
I might
person.
ask you this though: stratospheric aerosol injections. I'm not a big chemtrail guy. I have one page where I talk about a page that's on your Metabunk site.
Yeah.
John Brennan, when he talked about that. I do think it's interesting. Your whole point was that he wasn't talking about something that's going on now.
Yeah.
But there were people that said, well, why could we trust the government on whether it's going on now? And I think that's fair enough. Jim Mars is a researcher. He said sometimes that contrails will appear at in weather conditions or at altitudes where they shouldn't. You would say that's not true at all.
I would say that they might appear to be. Like, there's actually, real quick, there's a couple of types of contrails. There's the exhaust contrails, and then there's the aerodynamic contrails. The aerodynamic contrails are the ones that most often, I think, get misinterpreted as being chemtrails. If you look at the videos on geoengineeringwatch.org, which is the main chemtrail site, they show these videos of undeniable spraying. And they're actually just these videos of aerodynamic contrails, which is where the contrail forms over the wing. It's not actually coming out of the engines, it forms over the wing. And these contrails actually occur in different weather conditions to engine exhaust contrails. They can occur at much lower altitudes. So they can occur in locations where you quite often don't see contrails, on flight paths where you don't see contrails because the planes are normally too low because they're coming out of an airport. Like, I will see them occasionally on planes leaving Sacramento, because I'm kind of in the hills near Sacramento here. And the thing about the weather conditions, usually what's happening there is they're basing the weather conditions on what's called a sounding, like a weather balloon, basically. Weather balloons, they release them, they go up in the air, and they measure the temperature and humidity at various points. But the problem with weather balloons is that they only do one every 12 hours, usually, in most sites. And the weather balloon stations are separated by at least 200 miles each. So it's almost impossible that the precise temperature and humidity a weather balloon is measuring is really correlated with the weather where that contrail is. So it's very easy to say, this is the humidity, look at this sounding, and this is the plane, and it doesn't actually work. But if you're seeing a contrail at the back of the plane, that means that's actually the best indicator of the weather conditions that you can have. And it's almost like a little backwards problem, because it's like the plane itself is demonstrating that the conditions are right. That people will say, because of their very inaccurate forecasting of the conditions, that it's not right. But essentially there's nothing there, but it's a difficult thing to explain to people.
No, those are some good points. I get that. So, and you're saying too, when people point to like they're coming off the entire wing, they'll point to that being proof that it's not coming from the engine. So therefore, but you're saying there's an explanation for that.
Yeah. If you look up like aerodynamic and rainbow contrails, there's some classic photographs of them. But if you just do a Google image search for aerodynamic contrails, there's a couple of types of aerodynamic contrails. There's ones you see when a plane's landing, which are the kind of the vortexes that come off the wings, and then there's the high altitude ones, which they actually form persistent contrails, which come off the entire wing, and it's like a sheet, and then it kind of gets curled up in the vortices, so it looks a bit like a regular contrail further back, but it starts out looking kind of like a ribbon. Like a thin, flat ribbon earlier on. And sometimes it has color in it because of the way it hits the sun and the way the water droplets grow, which is very different to the engine exhaust. People see these colors and they think, oh, that means chemicals. But right. It's fairly obvious once you understand the mechanism of an aerodynamic contrail and you look at other examples of aerodynamic contrails, what's going on. There's a famous video of a KC-10, I think, leaving aerodynamic contrails, and there's audio that goes with the video, which is actually the pilots and the engineer in the cockpit, and they're saying things like, look at that plane spraying chemtrails, good job we're above it, we'd be dead right now. And it's fairly obvious that they're joking, right? But there was an Italian blogger called Tanker Enemy, and I think he didn't really understand that they were joking because his English isn't his first language, okay. And so he presented this as being proof that they were discussing chemtrails. But if you look at the actual video now, like the guy who put it up has put more videos up of him he's an actual KC-10 engineer, and he said this was just a hoax, and here's some other videos, and here's photos proving me doing this. And so, it was just these aerodynamic contrails. But the chemtrail people just cling on to this thing because it's such a nice video of these trails coming off. Essentially, it looks like the entire wing is spraying, but it's really just forming this contrail sheet because of the pressure drop over the wing.
Right. And like I said, it's not really one of my big issues. I have a page about it. I'll actually edit it a little bit based on some of the things we just talked about, but it basically focuses around John Brennan, which I do think it's interesting that he brought up stratospheric aerosol injections being used to combat climate change and things like that, because that is something that some theorists have been bringing up for a while, that that's what they're doing.
Well,
so
have you heard of David Keith?
David Keith? No.
He's perhaps one of the most famous geoengineering researchers out there, and he's written a book called The Case for Climate Engineering. He was on the Colbert Report years ago, and I actually just had him on my podcast, I think about 5 episodes back, and we discussed like basically the current state of geoengineering research and what's been done. And he says basically nothing has ever been sprayed out of a plane in pursuit of climate modification, climate engineering, or geoengineering. So there's really, from his perspective, there's nothing that's going on. And you should listen if you're interested in that topic. Like I recommend listening to that interview I did with him, Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I think it's episode 15, maybe. I could just check that real quick. You can go to TFTRH.com, or it's just anywhere. Let's see, episode 13. It's sandwiched in between, I think, Flat Earth and Planet X, which is a strange company for Professor Keith. But yeah, it's basically there's the research isn't there yet. They don't know how to do it. So they couldn't really have been doing it 20 years ago, because they still don't know now how to do it. So it's an interesting topic, though.
In my humorous way, I put on here, I put, they're not real. They're not real. You're crazy. I mean, they are real, but they're good, and we haven't used them yet.
Well, we certainly haven't used them, and they wouldn't look like what people are pointing to as contrails. You wouldn't actually leave trails like that. It would be kind of like they would do a haze, and it'd be much higher up. The stratosphere, most planes don't actually fly in the stratosphere.
Yeah, I saw that conversation. Some people were saying, well, some of them might be visible in the stratosphere, the lower stratosphere, and things like that. So
yeah,
I was looking. It was on your site. I was reading it. So.
Oh yeah, there was a big discussion about that, but there's what's called, I think, what is it? It's not the stratopause, is it? But it's the boundary between the troposphere and the stratosphere.
This was being discussed on a page about Brennan.
Yeah. No, I remember we having that discussion like years ago. Do planes fly in the stratosphere? Like there was one guy who thought that all contrails formed in the stratosphere, and we were saying no, most of them are in the troposphere. So anyway, it's just a big kind of technical discussion that's kind of a moot point, really. Well, we've kind of like gone well over an hour here, which has been a very interesting conversation. Is there anything you want to like close out with? You want to like mention your website or final words?
Sure. If people want to go on the positive side, I'm a supporter of President Trump. So 2020 elections coming up. Trumpisright.blogspot.com. I also have a huge page called Trump is Right, Trump is Wrong, and Mixed Bag. So I'm a pragmatic supporter. I try to criticize him where I think he needs criticizing, but I think he's a better choice than probably what we'll get on the other side. And I'm not a partisan person. I maybe lean a little bit right politically, but I'm moderate on a lot of things. I've definitely voted for Democrats. I voted for Obama twice. I'm not happy with those votes, but I did do it. So yeah, I'm not like a hyper-partisan person. So there's that. There's 911debunkers.blogspot.com, and I'll try to make some show notes for this show. Even if you don't include them, people can go to 911 Debunkers, and I'll put this interview up. And so anything I talked about, at least, I'll try to put some of the material where I'm referenced.
Cool. Anything you do, I'll put on the YouTube thing. I'll get it off your site, or you can send it to me. So,
okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Been very, very interesting again. And obviously, there's lots to talk about. We could just go on for hours, like nitpicking these little things. And it's good because I think, I tell you things that you might not know, and you tell me things that I might not know, and together we kind of synthesize something that's a bit closer to the truth.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's been fun.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.